welcome back. It's Christine again with the Artist Pod, and today we're going to be drawing a German Shepherd. Specifically, this German Shepherd's name is Benson. His human asked me to do it. The link to follow his Instagram, Benson's Instagram, is down below in the description. So, let's get arting. Alright, so here is the German Shepherd. He's got, black by his nose, black by his eyes, black on his forehead, and then a lot of brown. So yeah, we're just going to get started. I'm going to get started with the black. So I know that I like to let black stand on its own, but German Shepherds have too much black to let that happen. So like always, when I'm using gray for black, I've got to hold back once we add the shadows and highlights so that it still appears as black. In this step though, like always, as we're building up the strokes, right, it's always, two and then one in between, right? So two and then one in between, and just following the contour of the direction the hair would be going. So right up the nose, it's going to be straight. He's got some brown right here, and then looping it over as it comes to the side. Around the eyes, I'm always careful. Just like always, right, like we pick up the differences in the eyes, and if there's anything that's off, or it's impeding into the eye, or it's uneven, we'll notice that. So I'm always a little bit more careful around the eye, even with the fur. You can have the fur pushing into the eye, but it has to make sense. If the fur's going a certain way, right, like down here the fur's going down, so it wouldn't make sense for some of that to be sticking into the eye. But on this side it could. But German Shepherds, their hair is pretty short, so. Still have to draw on his nose, but sometimes I do that after we add the highlights and the shadows. So, I'm gonna start with the gray, since that's harder to do. Now that I'm adding highlights and shadows, it's always harder to draw gray to look black, while still giving it some highlights and shadows and some of that definition. We're going to have the light source coming from above and to the right. Like always, that means above and in front of, not behind or next to. And as I do it, I'll need to hold back pen pressure. Typically when I'm doing this, I'll hold back pen pressure on all of the black, and then I'll slowly add in extra lines to indicate that that area is brighter instead of more pen pressure. It'll be easier to kind of control that way. And then of course, his gums in here are black, and that would be pretty faded. Some of it's going to catch the light, certainly, but as you come back into the mouth here or on this side, it's going to fade significantly. So may have to take out some of the sketch to properly sort of indicate that he's, that it's pretty faded. But for now, we're just going to get started by the nose. And again, just holding back my pen pressure, but filling in the lines. He's a pretty cute pup. Now ideally, some of what's going to help this gray look black is the brightness of the colors around it. That's why this style or this method doesn't really work on an animal that's all black. They'll just appear gray because they're gray. There's nothing to sort of change the color or, make it seem darker than it is. So with any luck, this highlighting isn't too much, and the brown here will make it look black. Now this is full pin pressure. No longer gray, so I don't have to hold back. And I'll be blending in some of the colors so it's not as dramatic a changeover. Now unless the light source is next to the figure, which this is not, it's in front of, all edges will be in shadow. So even this edge that's on the side of the light source is going to be in shadow. And then it kicks right back into highlight, right? So I've already sketched in the shadow, and then it's right back into highlight. Whereas on this side, you're going to get all of this in shadow. Now, not all of this will be in shadow. There's going to be some transition that happens here. And then right under the eye, but I'm going to get the whole thing in shadow first. And to do the shadow, I'm just holding back my pin pressure. So I'm not changing my brush size. It remains always the same. I'm just holding back how much pressure I'm putting as I make the strokes. And that gives me more control as I want to fill more in. It's easier to add with this style than it is to erase something away. You can erase something away, but I find it easier to always add, and so if I'm needing to decide exactly where a highlight is going to change over, I typically do it in shadow first so that I have a little bit more control over exactly where that transition takes place, and I don't accidentally create a sort of a transition that's very jarring, right? Because you don't want a visible line. I don't want to look at this and be like, gosh, this line is where the light is turning over into shadow. I want it to be tapered in. That's what's going to make it look more natural. When I do it this way and I'm adding in highlights, typically the way that'll work is I don't need to put full pin pressure now because I put a layer of this sort of all these lines down. So just adding in more lines, not holding back necessarily, but not putting a lot of pressure, and just sort of adding more in will do it, will brighten it up. I'm going to give that little burst under his eye. Right, his eyes are facing forward. You have the light source coming from over here, so the nose would block some, but otherwise his cheek would be catching, just like on humans, particularly on forward-facing animals whose eyes are forward-facing. I'm going to taper that out. Right, so here, we have the top of the head going into the ear. So as the ear comes up on this side, this would be in highlight. Depending on how far down it comes, right, it comes down pretty far, so some of this would not be in highlight because the head would be blocking some of it. But as we come up, we're going to start seeing this transition. Now I'm going to mix in some of this brown into the gray that'll taper off the transitions. It's one way to make sure that it doesn't look jarring, as you can mix in particularly a lighter color on a darker color rather than a darker on a lighter. Sometimes you can't see the transition of darker to lighter, but alright, so I'm gonna get the tongue and then go back and finish off the ears. Some of what I just did is I'd drawn in the teeth, and that's going to indicate In some cases it may determine highlights and shadows. I don't actually think it will, especially, so with the light source coming over here, you're going to have the top of the mouth blocking some, but because his muzzle sticks forward, you're going to certainly catch light on some of this. Now, it's hitting the teeth over here and then dipping in, so there's going to be probably an extreme shadow over here, but you are going to have some highlighting on the edge before it does that. Likewise, on this side, it's coming back out. So with a light source coming in, it may not hit, but some of it may, right? So if the angle is this way, then it's this way. That's how we would determine shadows and highlights. Now, there's a big enough gap. Again, I may do this a little differently. It's going to kind of depend on exactly how it looks. And as it goes further back into the mouth, that would obviously taper out. So this would be in shadow coming down. Now the tongue flattens a bit. I'm going to go ahead and do the whole thing in shadow. It's going to make this a little easier, leaving enough room to really fan out as it goes back into his mouth. And there's a dip in the middle of the tongue, which would be, right around here. We would indicate that by a shadow on one side and a highlight on the other. Shadow on the side of the light source and a highlight against the side against it where the light would be catching. Now to finish out the ears, again, light source coming from over here, so this back side is going to be in shadow. And the opposite is true on this side. The back side here would be in highlight, because that light source is coming right on it. So German Shepherds, you can see the pink inside their ears. And it's not just specific German Shepherds. I know I'm drawing a specific one right now, but it's something I've noticed before. There's a little bit of hair coming down, and then what you'll see is the pink. So we're going to bring just this little bit of hair. This hair is all short, so this isn't long. Down in here it is, but up through this section it's not. It's just sort of this really short, fine hair that kind of gives way to the skin. Also going to be a little bit of highlight with the angle. Now the ear is dipping inward, but there's going to be a little bit of highlight hitting because that highlight, that source isn't, straight from above. It's just that little bit in front of as well. The nose, the same as the hair. I'm adding just a little bit of highlight, but trying to make sure it still looks black. And as you're highlighting any nose, right under the nostril is going to be in shadow. Obviously the top of the nose is going to be in highlight. As we come over here, because the light source is over, to the right, as we come to this side, it's going to taper off into shadow. And underneath. Probably going to be a little bit of highlight under this nostril because this is turned up, whereas the top of the nostril is turned down. Not much. And then indicating it like we did on the tongue, where the side of the dip in the nose is in shadow, and then the opposite side would be catching a little bit of highlight. Now the eyes. His eyes are brown. So I'm always going to draw out the pupil first on both sides just to make sure it looks like the figure's looking at us. As you know, I'm drawing out from the pupil. I always try to make the same line as what is the top of the eye above, right? So it's coming up here and then it dips down. So I'll mimic that, and then over here it dips down. You don't want it to go the opposite direction because it'll look out of place. Alright, light source coming from the right, so first I'm going to put a burst of light against the pupil on the opposite side of the light source, and then fill in the highlight on the side of the light source and going underneath the eye. Fading out on the edge. Alright, and then the last thing to do, one of the most important things to do, like I always say, is adding the light flare. It's always on the side of the light source in the highlight. You can make it whatever shape you want, but I'm going to do a circle for this one. We're just going to fill it to the foreground color, which I've already changed to white, and then do the same thing on the other side. Alright, so that is how you draw a German Shepherd. I hope that's helpful. In the floating nether next to me, I have other videos of art tutorials I have done, and I will see you all soon. Thank you so much. Take care.